Supposed biblical error, the release of Barabbas. Skeptics claim the story of Barabbas being released from prison, as presented in the Gospels, is likely a fabrication, because no other sources mention that Pilate allowed such a custom. Second, if the Gospels are true, Barabbas was arrested for insurrection against the Roman state, and the Romans would never release someone arrested for such crimes. And finally, the name Barabbas literally means son of the father, and such a person was likely invented for literary reasons, mainly to contrast him with Jesus, son of God the Father. The Jews asked for the sinful son of the Father to be released and condemned the righteous son of the Father. So the case is made this is a literary fabrication and is not historical. First, let's start with the claim that Pilate had a custom of releasing one prisoner at Passover. This is often dismissed because we hear about it in no other source, but this is just an argument from silence. Scholar Craig Evans says this line of reasoning smacks of scholarly bias. Let's remember that the Romans gave considerable flexibility to appointed rulers over different regions. They didn't run a nanny state. Wolfgang Kunkel says, local administration, the administration of justice as between the natives of the provinces, and many other tasks were in general simply left to the political organs of the subject people. Due to the size of the empire and the practicality of governing large territories, they allowed flexibility in how each province was ruled. Second, Craig Evans responds to this by highlighting several similar practices seen throughout the Roman Empire. A papyrus from 85 AD quotes a Roman governor over Egypt. "You are worthy of scourging, but I give you to the crowds." In one of his letters, Pliny the Younger mentions a group of people released from prison to explain how they were let out. He says, "It was asserted, however, that these people were released upon their petitions to the proconsuls, or their lieutenants, which seems likely enough, as it is improbable any person should have dared to set them at liberty without authority." An inscription in Ephesus mentions a decision of a proconsul to release prisoners because of the outcries of the people. Josephus tells us Herod Archelaus released several prisoners to appease his fellow Jews. When Albinus left office over Judea, he released all prisoners that were not worthy of death. And finally, in the later Mishnah, there might be an allusion to this practice mentioned in the Gospels. It reads, "They may slaughter the Passover lamb for one, who they have promised to bring out of prison." So the line about promising to free someone they release from prison for Passover observance could relate to the practice detailed in the Gospels. The evidence indicates different rulers would release prisoners to appease crowds and the people they governed. So Pilate having a similar custom does fit with the cultural context, and dismissing it by arguing from silence is nothing more than scholarly bias. Next, as we noted already, the Romans bent the rules when it was politically useful or convenient. Things were not always so black and white. Plutarch tells us at one point some of Caesar's men mutinied and killed 2 praetors, but Julius Caesar let them off with a slap on the wrist. Josephus, in his account of his own life, notes that after the fall of Jerusalem, he begged Caesar Titus to spare several former companions and acquaintances, and it was granted to him. He even convinced Titus to take down 3 former companions who were already condemned to die by crucifixion. These men were already placed on crosses, and yet they were removed at Josephus' request. Many of the people Josephus petitioned for were involved in the Jewish war, and therefore involved in insurrection. And some, who were even condemned to die, had their sentences reversed. So, it's not inconceivable that Pilate would let someone who committed murder and insurrection off to appease the crowds. It is possible he was no longer considered a threat and had a force of warriors waiting for him in the mountains. Rome may have determined that Barabbas was no longer a problem, much like how the Jews, that Josephus petitioned for, were already defeated and subdued, and therefore no longer a threat. Finally, the name Barabbas does mean son of the father, but it is not like someone could not have been named that. On a Jewish ossuary, we have found the name Barsabbas, meaning son of the elder. It has also been demonstrated that Abba, meaning father, was also a proper name. Sometimes Jews went by their surname, like Barnabas or Barsabbas. We also mainly know of a Jewish rebel leader from a century later named Simon, but by his surname Bar Kochba. So it is not inconceivable someone could have had a surname Barabbas, especially given the cultural context. Mike Lacona, while studying the various spellings and uses of names in Plutarch, notes ancient authors could select different components of a person's name to provide. It should also be noted that just because similarities between Jesus and Barabbas exist, that doesn't mean the story was fabricated. Humans tend to seek out patterns that they find in real life and highlight them. People often note the similarities between John Kennedy and Abraham Lincoln, even though they are both historical, and the similar events surrounding them are just coincidental. It is human nature to highlight similarities to note patterns, while ignoring differences. The Gospel authors also highlighted patterns they found, because they were also humans with a pattern-seeking nature, and their audiences would have enjoyed such highlights for the same because they were also humans with a pattern-seeking nature, and their audience
What does gospel author highlighted patterns, meaning that outside of the gospel they make this remark, or the gospel itself that was authored by the gospel authors highlighting patterns? And it's good that he said that, of course, all the gospel authors are human themselves, right? So, yeah, gospel is authored by human authors.
Would have enjoyed such highlights for the same reason we do today. For example, the gospel authors often would write about the events surrounding Jesus to parallel Old Testament passages.
So the gospel authors would often would write about the events surrounding Jesus to parallel Old Testament passages. So, meaning that the literary style, the style of writing, is by themselves, right? And of course, I understand for Christian, Bible is not an equivalent to Quran, not parallel to Quran, right? It's not even parallel to Hadith. I think it's parallel to Sirah then, right? Because the author have their own style of telling the story, and perhaps to give certain effect. Hence, it is being told in a certain way. So that's, I think this portion actually affirms my conception about Bible, what it is, right? So it is closest to Sirah from that perspective rather than the Hadith, because the Hadith, when anyone who want to convey or relay what Prophet Muhammad SAW said, it is, you don't just take the meaning and say, unless you are telling, unless you are recalling an event you observe, but the saying itself is as best, trying to be preserved as what was said in the original way of saying, right? But to be fair, in that case, it can be similar to Hadith, where it is not the sayings of Prophet Muhammad SAW that is conveyed, but the actions that is being observed. But still, because Hadith is not like a story, a long story, right? So because each individual Hadith stands on its own, so in that case, it's still really close or closer to the Sirah. And we have seen that different compiler of Sirah have different approach and different style.
This was a common cultural theme that we even see in Tacitus and Virgil. Modern events were written in a way to parallel some event that had already happened, or parallel something in mythology. This doesn't mean the event didn't happen. Given the amount of stories from the Hebrew Bible, the Gospel authors had a large library of already existing stories they could pull from. If things were slightly different, they could have just found another old...
Now,
didn't happen. Given the amount of stories from the Hebrew Bible, the Gospel authors had a large library of already existing stories they could pull from.
So, I guess this point is where, when Christian talk to me about the Quran, and with the assumption that Prophet Muhammad SAW is pulling in from previous sources like the Bible, it is because the Gospel is written in such a way, right? They can pull from earlier sources, and it's human action to pull something in, and hence they project that idea onto the Quran, I think, right? Because when they keep accusing that this is copied from earlier text, etc., I guess it's based on their understanding on how the Gospel is written.
If things were slightly different, they could have just found another Old Testament story to parallel to Jesus. If Peter actually went to the cross with Jesus and didn't abandon him, they could paint Jesus and Peter as another Moses and Aaron going before the Pharaoh. If Judas didn't hang himself but repented, they could parallel him to Jonah or David after the affair with Bathsheba, or even King Manasseh. Likewise, the Gospel authors simply seized on similarities between Jesus and Barabbas without telling us the differences, as humans often do, to make the story more interesting. It is
to make the story more interesting, yeah. So that capture the reason of writing, right? Because you wouldn't see the Quran or the Hadith is being conveyed to make things interesting. So I guess because it is a literature, being authored by human for a certain intention, right? So given that the Christian that is making this video is saying that, you know, the author of the gospel is writing, and the way they write is to make things interesting. So that is interesting. I have never heard any Christian say it as such before, which makes into it a different perspective, I would say, because Quran is never, you know, no Muslim, no one can ever accuse Muhammad SAW trying to make things interesting with the Quran. He has just to convey it, even if when the verse is actually against him, or actually saying things about him that he should correct his action, etc.
Far too speculative to assume that just because there are similarities, Barabbas was a myth. Thus, once we actually apply the cultural context in multiple ways, this alleged error can be resolved.
Alright, so yeah, that's all I have with this one, because this is the first time I have heard of Barabbas anyway, so I don't even know what this is all about. But I assume it is about those who are against the Bible trying to use this to say that there's mismatch with regard to the story, and it doesn't make sense that the story happened, right? Something like that. Anyway, thank you for watching. See you next time.